if consumption is about asserting these monistic constraints, the fact that how would you say it? I need sustenance in a sense to keep my body, that my body is operating and it has this energy and it's exhausting that energy out, and I need to somehow pull energy back in.
Yeah.
Right. And so I need a sufficient maintenance of energy to keep this life thing going, because if my body was a closed system, I would not need to consume to keep it alive.
Yeah.
But it's an open
also
system.
points to the fact that it's an interaction between life and death, because it's like it's what you need to sustain your life, but you eat dead things.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So
yeah, though the way he talks about the Eucharist makes that more complicated.
Yes.
And I don't actually understand. I understand the point of why the Eucharist is relevant, but I don't understand how it works.
He wants to talk to the Eucharist because he wants to point toward the way in which the Eucharist is pointing toward the way in which the victory of the principle of life is inevitable.
Yeah.
Because the Eucharist is the meal where we're, instead of eating the body of death that we're forced to eat in normal consumption, we're now eating the body of immortal life. I would like to welcome Marcus Shera back to Grail Country. Marcus has been my guest before. We actually started this project a while ago, and then, important life things were happening for Marcus and we weren't able to get back to it. So we're just actually going to kind of like reboot the entire thing. And we're going to try to tackle this in 3 parts, but we're going to do a series on Sergei Bulgakov's 1912 book, Philosophy of Economy. And Marcus is an economist, and we met originally at the DC conference, and we've been staying in touch ever since. And I think Marcus has a lot of great ideas and is an interesting fellow. I'm looking forward to talking to him again. Marcus, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about your background for the audience?
Yeah, sure. I've been around the TLC for a while, in and out. So a lot of people have probably met me or talked to me before. I was at the Northwestuary conference, for those of you that were there, and we talked and all sort of such stuff. But just like very briefly who I am, I'm an economist. And right now I'm a postdoc at Chapman University. So I live right between where the Chino estuary happens and where Jacob Federecci and his gang have an estuary. So I go to both of those. But in the fall, or basically in a month, I'm moving back to my home state, Philadelphia, or home city, Philadelphia, where I'm going to be teaching as assistant professor of economics at Eastern University. So I'll be there for the foreseeable future.
All right. So you indicated to me earlier when we were kind of chatting back and forth that you had made some notes, and given your expertise, I'll go ahead and I'll let you kind of lead this time, and I'll follow your lead and see where I can contribute. Obviously, I'll be of more use talking about the philosophical, theological foundation stuff than I will be on the economic stuff, but I will probably have some thoughts on that too, because not being an expert has never stopped me from expressing my views in the past. Yeah. So go ahead, Marcus. Where would you like to start on this?
Yeah, I guess a lot of things. I guess I would recommend, if people are really interested, to watch the video that we did back about a year ago, because it'll fill in some of the gaps. But having watched that and then having reread the same chapters that we went over, it's so rich. This book is incredibly rich. So it feels like it's like scary how rich it is, because
it really is. It really gets to it really justifies, I think for someone like you who's made it your academic discipline to study economy, one of the things about this book is that it really does shed light on how fundamentally important economy is. Mm-hmm. And that we may not have given enough consideration to how important economy is as a discipline. And as you can see through Bulgakov's eyes, and as he talks about how deeply it is connected to our theology. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, and I guess what I had failed to do in the last conversation was to read the introduction, where it goes through a little bit of his personal development and what he was the kinds of questions he was interested in asking when he wrote this book. So, a very brief thing is I guess he grew up in the Russian Orthodox Church like most little Russian boys, in the 19th century.
From a family, from I think 6 generations of parish priests.
Yeah, so, which is impressive. Yeah, he's like their Paul van der Clay line or something like that.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, but he, like many young people, ends up going into a sort of Marxist direction, was very interested in Western philosophy and how that could inform and make more clear the muddled Russian identity, which, if you've read any Dostoevsky books, and he cites or he quotes Dostoevsky a couple times in the chapters that we read so far, is Dostoevsky's always dealing with characters like this who are dealing with Russian reality, Russian facts, Russian people, but they're interested in solving these Russian problems with Western ideas. And so a lot of the Dostoevsky stories are about the mismatch, in a sense, between these more consistent, clear, rationalistic, maybe you'd think, ideas to the Russian reality. And so
what struck me about that, though, Marcus, is that and actually, it didn't strike me until you started talking about it, because I kind of knew what you were talking about from the introduction. But it struck me as you were talking about it that there's like that essentially what the Russian sensibility brings to the problem of philosophy is a much higher degree of concern for application. There's a pragmatic streak that is actually very reminiscent of the American impulse.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of a kindred spirit there between the way the Russian mind wants to approach philosophy and the way Americans want to approach philosophy.
Which is, I guess, why they were the only ones that could muster a Cold War against each other later. And so that's actually the first thing that I wrote down here, so apparently I read this in the introduction last week, but apparently he's very attracted to the positivist philosophies, which were more popular in the 1830s and 1840s. And this is people like the Saint-Simonians and Auguste Comte. Those particular French thinkers are what get called the positivist school. So, I've only read about them from their critics, to be fair. Right. But Friedrich Hayek has in his, I forget the exact name of the book, but studies in his general project called The Studies of the Use and Abuse of Reason, he considers these people abusers of reason, right? In that they take abstractions, or they take their understandings of the world and overimpose it to reality, and imagine that when they've developed a representation of the world, they can then utterly plan the way that the world is constructed. Right?
Yeah, he actually has equal vitriol toward the positivists and the idealists. Right. He actually calls Hegel Luciferian.
Yeah, well, yeah, good for him. But it seems as if it said something very briefly that I'd want to know more about. That he apparently ends up rejecting his Marxism because Marxism, for whatever reason to him, in some particular case, did not understand agricultural reality, or the reality of producing in agriculture. So there's some specific fact that Marxist theory is supposed to explain, which it just is not working.
He couldn't make it work. Yeah, he couldn't apply it. Yeah.
And so ultimately, in the introduction, I forget the name. Catherine, I think, is the name of the writer of the introduction.
Yes, Catherine Ustav, I think, is.
Eftahov.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and so in some sense, positivism fails the pragmatic test, right? Which is and so if you go back like 5 years and watch the rando conversation that I did with van der Clay, the thing I say in that video is the part of Jordan Peterson that people need to dig deeper into is his indebtedness to the American pragmatists, particularly William James. Yeah. Right. And so I put my William James on the desk here. These are my collected William James. And then this is Henri Bergson, right? Mm-hmm. Who Bulgakov several times refers to Bergson and the pragmatists, referring to these people.
Yeah, it's high praise for Bergson.
Yeah.
Bergson and Schelling are the ones that he likes.
Yes. And who are Western thinkers, right?
Yeah.
Who are kind of in the same vein, the same line of criticism of Western thought that he is in, right? But so it fails the pragmatic test in that what the pragmatists say is that the purpose of knowledge or abstraction or thinking in general is to answer questions that you find yourself having in practice, right? So you don't just sort of jettison yourself into contemplation to understand the world and then develop a theory of how might I act in this world. You find yourself in the midst of life, confronting questions, and then thought is one of your aids in answering those questions.
Right.
So positivism does it backwards in that it starts with thought, it starts with reflection and contemplation and rationalism, and then tries to induce from that a theory of action, which in a sense is actually very similar to Hume's supposed is-ought problem, which he only mentions once and doesn't mention in the rest of his work. In a sense, you can actually read Hume as a pragmatist by coming up with the is-ought distinction, where he goes, if someone does all of this supposedly pre-life intellectual activity and then tries to impose it on the world, you'll end up with radical skepticism every time, right? So it doesn't actually solve any of your issues, right? Whereas the way that Hume actually ends up discussing things in the rest of his career,
you're also going to lack the flexibility and adaptability to change when you're confronted with reality not matching your models.
Yes. Which is so William James calls another part of his doctrines radical empiricism, when he's like, I'm an empiricist in that I have to deal with the facts that are in front of me, right? But I'm also a radical empiricist in that I consider all of the different things in which you might encounter in your life, mental activity, emotional, empirical activity, are all part of the things which I'm experiencing and I'm trying to work through.
Yeah, I think Peterson is kind of working in that same strand too, because I think that and it's not really that surprising for a psychologist to do this either. What Peterson is trying to do is to try to get people to take their inner experience seriously as relevant empirical information.
Yeah,
that should also be part of the equation. Which very much lines up with Bulgakov's approach here, because he's like, essentially for Bulgakov, what he's saying is that it is in acting in the world that the subject-object divide is transcended.
Yes, yeah, and so that's why economics as a discipline is so important, because it studies people. In a sense, a necessary precondition for the kind of thing that economics studies, people acting in the world, necessitates people having overcome some of these problems, at least in practice, epistemologically, right? And for me to act, I have to have some sense of understanding that I know something about the world and can act upon it, right? That's so economics, in a sense, is studying people post them solving this philosophical problem, which philosophy itself has not solved.
Correct.
Or critical philosophy itself has not solved.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's why this is what I was going to leave at the end. But he says, like, the last line of the third chapter that we read is something like, political economy is actually ahead of philosophy in some of these questions, because it has this category of labor. Or labor is, in a sense, the subject impressing itself upon the object, but then simultaneously being constrained by the object, right? So the relation between subject and object is presupposed to be solved.
Yeah, the way he talked about labor is very interesting, because it very much puts the emphasis on relation. Like, that's what essentially, I mean, and that's why his definition of labor is so broad and encompassing. It's a much more expansive definition of labor than what Marx gives as a definition for labor. Yeah, and because essentially what it boils down to is that all interaction with reality is labor.
Yeah. including mental activity.
Right. Yes.
Like that, right?
Exactly.
And so certain schools of economics, modern schools of economics, would appreciate a perspective like that, right? But it's very interesting. I was going to get into this later. I'd written down to get into this later, but he talks about, because I said this in the first time we did this video too. I'm more of a free market economist kind of guy, right? I went to George Mason, for those of you who knows what that means, right? And I love Adam Smith. So every time he brings up Adam Smith, I want Bulgakov to be on Smith's team, right?
Yeah.
That's my bias. And so he mentions Smith in these various ways. That's almost like saying he's half right, but he's not even saying he's half wrong. And it's particularly on this point when he talks about like the way that Smith talked about labor, right?
Yeah, I think Bulgakov has this very heavy emphasis on what he wants to emphasize is like the spirit in which we're acting is more important than the formal structure of the institutions that we're acting through. So I just think he's kind of agnostic about the institutional forms.
Yeah, well, like with respect
to he's not agnostic because he's definitely he's against Marxism.
Yeah,
and I think his problem with and I think maybe he thinks that they're like political economy is missing something that really does go beyond a Marxist framing.
Yeah,
and I think I don't have to guess because he pretty much says that all political economy is essentially working within a Marxist framework, even those who oppose Marxism.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that wouldn't be strictly true because I think later on he talks about the Kantian perspective on these issues, which would be entirely subjective or entirely from the frame of the subjective instead of Marx, which is entirely from the frame of the objective. But with respect to Adam Smith, it's not clear which side he puts Smith on because I think Smith is pre-Kant.
Right.
Smith is a Humean and he's pre-Kant. So
that's true.
Yeah. So Smith is.
There's no hostility toward Adam Smith. Not in the same way that there clearly is toward Marxism. So
yes, certainly. But sometimes he brings up Smith and Marx in the same paragraph, and also we'll talk about that later. But the last thing about the intro is that he talks about labor as an epistemic act. So when you are asserting yourself on the world, or when you perform some act that we call an act of labor, an economic act of labor, you're both presupposing that you know something about the world, so there's knowledge involved in doing the act, but there's also knowledge gained from the feedback from the act. Like I invest in this company and then it goes bankrupt, right?
Right.
There's both in my investment, there's an assertion about knowledge that I have, and in the feedback, the loss or profit from that institution, there's knowledge gained. So that's the forces of death in a sense, which we'll talk about in a second, informing me whether or not I was correct about the world in my initial assertion of knowledge.
Right, and you can't, and you really kind of have to act in the world. You have to perform judgments and act in the world before you can find that out whether you were right or not.
There's a little bit of trial and error, I guess, which might own that error might only be there in a world of sin, in a sense.
Right.
But we don't need to get into that. He does talk about the Edenic economy, but he hasn't in the more concrete parts of the book. He hasn't talked about that yet. But
correct.
Yeah. So chapter 1.
Yeah, let's move on to chapter 1.
Yeah.
All right.
So he has like a he's talking about a lot of things in the first chapter. Very summary kind of stuff, and he's setting up a lot of the categories that he works with, and the rough both philosophical problems and actual discussions of categories in political economy that he's going to bring out in the rest of the book. But the interesting thing is where he goes when he wants to define economics, right, or define the topic of economics. And the most general or the most pithy way I can kind of state what he thinks economics is about life, some organism that we call life, when it is confronted with death or these amassed forces of death. So in some sense, what economists are studying is the struggle between organisms, self-perpetuating in some sense bodies, against the fact that those bodies are subject to necessary mechanical forces that we kind of collectively call the forces of death.
Right.
And so it's not so the way that some economists like to talk about economics is, we're the social science that admits the hard realities of the world, right? Mm-hmm. We admit, like a sociologist might say, well, this form of society is where people get along because of their race or because of their class or because of their social identity, this or that. And economists say, I don't care about any of that stuff. You need to have enough food to survive. Boom. That's a hard fact, right? Yeah. So economics is just studying what those hard facts are. And so the way that Bulgakov talks about it is it's a back and forth between that there are constraints, that there are what economists would call scarcity. There is scarcity in the world. There are insufficiencies of the resources that we need to survive in some sense, but also you need to study the way in which the forces that are rallied against those constraints operate both internally and between one another, and when they are confronted with those death forces.
Yeah, what he ends up saying is that ultimately that the death forces end up serving the forces of life.
Yes, but only if life can solve the puzzle in a sense,
right?
Or address the concern properly.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Which kind of that reminds me of like of kind of like the Jewish notion of tikkun olam.
Oh.
The repair of the world. Like I think that's like that like the kind of like idea of the Edenic economy that Bulgakov is trying to explicate, like ties into that. It's like, yeah, that the forces of death are present in the world, but through human action, the forces of life can triumph.
Yeah, but also in the Christian story, then there's something about what humans did at one point that had them fall out of the Edenic economy, right? Whatever exactly we mean by that is not clear yet. But there's something about human failure and through human action, a restoration of these things. But he also says that, okay, well, you can think of all of these resources that I guess I'm alive right now, let's say, right? So suppose I'm alive. I'm doing various things to struggle against the forces of death. I eat, I make sure I have enough money to buy food from the supermarket, things like that, right? But there is also some sense in which all of these forces that my body can generate are insufficient to overwhelm all those forces of death. So from a Christian perspective, from a more theological perspective, the gift of life is not generated by my life, right? So the total solution to my death can only be through someone else. Let's say his name is Jesus, helping me out. Right?
Well, you don't have to. I mean, he says resurrection. He points directly at resurrection as the principle. So, so he doesn't shy away from expressing it in quite explicitly religious terms.
Yeah.
He knows wrote this before he became. This was written in 1912 when he was sort of like he hadn't decided to become a priest and follow the family profession yet. He didn't. He didn't become a priest until 1917, I think, like right during the Revolution.
Oh wow!
So
yeah, in the introduction is that he actually was in Russia still for the first few years of the Revolution, and then got exiled to France with all of the other Russian priests that got exiled.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah. But so one thing that he says that I was not exactly sure what to think about was he distinguishes between political economy as a science, and then the philosophy of economy. I didn't exactly understand this, but roughly what he summarizes at one point is something like political economy studies the what, and philosophy of economy studies the how, which I almost thought was backwards if I was to guess. In that philosophy of economy is studying the essences of these matters, and political economy is studying the day to day, blow by blow. How much, what GDP does America have, blah, 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 things like that, right? So what do you think about that? What did you get out of him talking that way?
I thought that he, which I remember, is like, I know that he's very critical. He's much more critical of political economy. And it is the fact that it is political economy that he's talking about when he says that that contemporary political economy is effectively all Marxists, even those who stand opposed to Marxism are effectively Marxists. And it seems to me to be like political economy is what you were describing when you were describing the kind of, I think that might have been off camera. You were talking about the kind of like left-brain approach that we're kind of like forced into, to kind of try to like build. I think that's what he has in mind. I think for him, the philosophy of the economy is what comes out of this kind of like philosophy that is based in action. That is the by basically measuring what happens when you actually act in the world and taking that feedback to determine whether you're on the right track or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but he thinks that you have to, like, he definitely thinks there are frameworks that are more helpful. So he thinks that, like, having the right definitions of what the forces are, which for him are life and death and labor, are the primary lenses he wants to use in establishing a philosophy of economy. Mm-hmm. Whereas political economy is the actual, like, policy making that would come out of the philosophy of economy, which does seem almost flipped, right? Because I think from our point of view, it's like the theory stuff would be the philosophy of economy, and applying it into and applying those principles into the economy and making policy would be the political economy. And that's not quite what it is for Bulgakov, because he thinks that basically, I think what he's trying to point toward is that there be more interplay
mm-hmm.
between what he wants is for the philosophy of economy piece to inform what we're doing in the political economy more.
Yeah.
Well, so that the philosophy part is less this armchair philosophy that he doesn't have any taste for,
mm-hmm.
and also has a kind of a pragmatic orientation to it.
Yeah, which is in this section, he says the fact that I'm even saying philosophy of X rubs some people the wrong way, because exactly. Philosophy should be pure of these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
Right. Putting philosophy and economy in the same, I guess, term is like ugly to some people. Right.
Right.
But what I took.
But ironically, the way he approaches it, he ends up making it like deeply ontological in the same way that like pure philosophy would be.
Yeah, but so I think that to some degree, what he means when he says that political economy studies the what is that he's giving someone license to take a lot of the body of political economy as it exists, even if he's critical of it. Right. And say, oh, some of this is still true, you know.
He actually does. Yeah, he does specifically grant that.
Yeah, so like, we need so much lumber to produce a ship, you know. He's like, yeah, I'm sure people know that. People know how to build ships. I don't know how to build ships. They're doing political economy. They're studying management of a system of resources. And plenty of in a sense, maybe they're studying some of these mechanical laws of necessity, which one must admit, right?
Right, but if you don't have a good philosophy of economy, then it will keep you from understanding why things failed.
Yeah,
you might think like, for example, you could conclude when that you had the wrong model when it wasn't actually the wrong model at all.
Yeah.
So
it's more, philosophy of economy is something that, but I would say definitely today, maybe even less so back then, economists are underinvested in the sense that it's a way of thinking about it. It's a set of ideas and concepts that would help you realize when you are doing political economy correctly as a whole or not. But I did take what he said about political economy to be a little bit of license to import something like ceteris paribus. I don't know if you're familiar with that in economics. It's the idea. Well, ceteris paribus, it's just Latin meaning everything else left equal, right? Mm-hmm. So in an intro econ class, I would say something like, let's say that there's a war in some country, and so there's a negative supply shock of oil. What's going to happen to the price of oil, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, it'll go up, right? This is our simple supply and demand model. We'll say something like that about the price. But then someone can raise their hand in the back of the room and say, oh, well, but Tesla is a new popular company and electric cars are becoming more popular. So oil is less necessary. So the demand should be going down too. And the price is going down. And I go, whoa. For the purpose of this model, we're saying everything else is left equal. You know,
gotcha.
We're just trying to move this one variable and see how we think the whole system moves. In the real world, so many things are happening all at once.
Right.
But for the purpose of analyzing how does this war affect the price of oil, we can still say it should go up ceteris paribus. Even if a war happens, the price goes down because other things are going on. Right. So he's saying, like, in a sense, it's licensed to cordon off parts of the world and assume away all of this complication that you would have to bring in if you're doing a philosophy of economy to analyze, hey, what's going to happen to the price of oil right now, right? So that's still legitimate contribution to the world when you say something like that.
Yeah. And I think that's why he talks about it in terms of organism.
Yes.
because an organism, it's like an organism also, it inhabits an ecosystem and an environment too. And so when you're talking about things in terms of organism, the number of things that you have to account for in order to explain that what's going on with an organism is pretty broad.
Yes.
Almost infinite, really.
It's like a biology study of biology is what actual biologists are doing in labs is often very specialized to specific things. Like my cousin studies neuroscience or neurochemistry or something, one of these very niche fields. And so she studies specifically the chemical reactions that happen in the eye, which is a legitimate.
Wait a minute. Where did your cousin go to school?
UC Irvine.
Oh, okay. Because I have a cousin who's a neuroscientist that was studying the same thing at Georgia Tech.
Okay, well,
that is so weird.
There's eyeballs in UC Irvine and at Georgia Tech. So
yeah. I guess it's a thing. Like, he was actually studying the relationship between the size of the iris and general intelligence.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think she's studying more like blindness. How do you fix blindness? Okay. Chemical blindness, right? So you can be a chemist, and then you have to know these things about specific atoms and molecules to study what's going on in the eye. But to understand the purpose of the eye in the whole biological organism's self-perpetuation is another question entirely, right? Which you would need a philosophy of biology or like an evolutionary theory to understand.
Right.
I guess so again on page 68 he says he gives his like definition pretty clearly, so I'll just try to reread it one more time, which is if you want, you can pull it up if you want to use the present, if you have a digital copy. Let me see. Actually, this page.
Actually, if you don't, I do. I can bring it up on my Kindle app.
Go for it.
And I'll bring it up.
Yeah, but now that I'm looking at the page, maybe this is not the page with the best definition on it.
Which definition are you looking for?
I was looking at page 68, just his general definition of economy.
Okay. Chapter. It's in section 5 of chapter 1.
Yeah.
Is it right at the beginning of the heading, or?
Yeah, maybe I'll just read these two paragraphs because we got to give the listeners some idea of his.
Yeah, let's do. Let me go ahead and share my screen and bring it up so they can follow along here.
Yeah. We'll do a Sherry style reading.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, I'll read these two paragraphs.
Okay.
In the current empirical world, life lives only in a constant struggle with death. The organic world, the kingdom of life in its various forms, is surrounded by a hostile atmosphere of death, of the deadened and mechanistic, of stifling necessity. Under the heavy shroud of graying skies, under this leaden sky, on a poisoned, plague-ridden earth, life seems a sort of accident, an oversight or indulgence of the part of death. Encircled by a ring of death, constantly threatened by the yawning abyss of non-being, life timidly and stingily huddles in the corners of the universe, saving itself from final extermination only through a terrible struggle. For if it cannot be completely exterminated, life is constantly in the process of being destroyed as it becomes the prey of non-being, waiting to strike from all sides and in all guises. Life is not separated from non-being by an impenetrable wall that would make these attempts futile. It is imperfect in itself, for it is fragile, temporary, and mortal. The coexistence of life with death, the living with the non-living, the material, is one of reality's greatest paradoxes and an eternal riddle for the mind. There is only life, and all that exists only in the light of life. Things, so-called dead nature, that is, everything in which the signs of life are apparently absent, are only a minus of life, its negative coefficient. But outside of this definition, which, though negative, is expressed in terms of life, things turn into phantoms and disappear. They are visible only in the light of life, as objects emerge from the meonic darkness of non-being, potential being, when the sun rises and disappear again into non-being in the dark of night. Even death exists only thanks to life and in its light. Death is non-life, for it is defined only as the negation of life. It is but the shadow of life, and outside of life it is nothing. It does not exist. God made not death, Wisdom of Solomon 1:13. It does not have an independent strength of being. We cannot say that the absolute nothing, and then he uses some Greek words here that I can't pronounce. The absolute nothing is, it drags along its contingent existence as a shadow of being, or its mirror image, requiring some kind of true being for its phantom existence. Still, the struggle between life and death, light and darkness, and the living and the thing-like penetrates our entire life, rendering it imperfect, limited, non-absolute.
Yeah. So that thing-like thing is important for him, and he expands on that for like even more by the end of chapter 3.
Yeah.
I love that section. And the thing that struck me about that later on, building on that, he says that essentially we have to kill nature in order to study it. Mm-hmm. Like that we have to reduce it to its thingness, which is why he favors this approach of just essentially jumping into the stream of the real and acting in the world, as opposed to trying to build a perfect system, because you're not going to be guilty of reducing everything to that thing. If you're in our actions, we actually overcome that strong subject object divide that he wants to avoid. And I couldn't help it reminded me, because when he talks about the way that we kill it, it's like the way that we kill nature to study nature is very, very similar to the way we end up killing God. Because the God that we kill in the death of God that Nietzsche is talking about is the God that we have approached through our abstract propositions about God, doing onto theology. It's not the God we interact with in the living world of nature that we've killed.
Yeah, and what, the way you just said it there reminded me of something in Adam Smith, which this is from, this is probably the most famous passage, or second or third, from his other book, not The Wealth of Nations, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, right. which in which he talks about a character that he calls the man of system, or a man who's taken systematization and acts on the world according to his system without the imagination to realize that there are forces in the world which he has not considered in his system.
Right.
So he says, like, someone who acts, and he's thinking of a politician acting upon a group of people, primarily acting on, he says, who he imagines that he can impress upon the world like he's impressing upon chess pieces on a board, who do not have a principle of motion of their own. Right. So in the terms of the way that Bulgakov talks about the forces of death here, you might think of it as like someone who thinks that they're like, okay, freeze frame, I have all my data about the world, I now understand all the forces of death, and I'm going to act against them, having ignored some particular force of death, and so that when he moves forward in the world, it kind of stabs him, because he didn't realize that there was a spear sticking out, and he walks right through it and dies, right? And his system immediately collapses, or the actions, his life dies because he over-systematized the force that he's actually trying to deal with.
Right. Well, this is why Jordan Peterson's like mantra of acting in the world as if God exists is actually, better for the soul than having memorized and being able to perfectly represent Aquinas's 5 ways with perfect accuracy.
And people,
the God that you're acting as if exists by your actions in the world is more real. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. I know I'm going to offend some Thomists by saying that, but it's just the case.
So, and people think often, at least in popular parlance, the as if there means something like pretend that the values that are attributed to traditional religion just are true, and then like pretend. Right, and then things will get solved. Right, but a better way to think about it is realize, and it's almost like realize through faith that there's another character in this world who you do not understand, who you can never include into your system, and actually you can think of it as having created and undergirding everything else that you're working with.
And Peterson actually does understand that. That's why he keeps pointing at Abraham. Abraham, to get up and follow the voice of God calling him, Abraham didn't like sit back and like work out a perfect system of theology he just got up and followed. He was led by his actions.
Yeah.
He followed the voice of God and acted in the world. Which is why Peterson keeps pointing at that. Like, it should be obvious that that's what he means. He's actually calling people into faith in the very proper sense, because faith that is really faith leads to you doing stuff in the world.
Yeah.
Or it isn't faith.
Yeah, that's the fear and trembling kind of perspective on Abraham.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That was fresh on my mind because I just recorded a conversation with a friend of mine who lives in I think he lives in South Carolina now, but he's originally from North Carolina. But we had a conversation about Jordan Peterson's God.
Oh,
because I think people get it. Yeah.
I listened to some of that.
Okay, the first hour was probably where I did my best stuff, and it kind of got into the weeds on some some of Jordan Wood's theology. But the first part of it, where I was explicating Peterson, I think I did a good job.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So. Okay, this is one thing also that I wanted to bring up is as I was reading and rereading my notes, I made a list of because when he's talking about philosophy and the issues with idealist philosophy and positivist philosophy, he's and essentially the progeny of Descartes in some way are
the philosophy of the subject and the philosophy of the object both get it wrong, basically.
Which, by the way, Adam Smith was very much anti-Team Descartes, as was Friedrich Hayek, as were a long line of a certain tradition of liberals. Right. Yes. So if you read that essay, Individualism, True and False, that I sent you is from Hayek, and he's basically identifying two liberal traditions or two individualistic traditions that he calls them. One that's following Descartes and one that's not. And so the people that he thinks of as more on Team Descartes are maybe Locke in some respects, but also then Rousseau, right? Mm. And then the people who are against are Hume, Smith, and Burke, and then Lord Acton.
Gotcha.
Right? So, that's kind of an aside though. But so what I did when rereading and going through the notes is there's a lot of dichotomies that he brings up, which all you can kind of get a sense are in each dichotomy. One of the two terms is analogous to all of these other terms and these other dichotomies that he brings up. So I'm just going to list them and see what you think about what they are. So the one is subjective, objective, and I'll do them in order with respect to each other, which ones are on the same side, right? Subjective, objective, spirit, matter, masculine, feminine, man, nature, organism, mechanism, culture, nature, animate, inanimate, ideal, real, freedom, necessity, living, and /thing. And that's not to say that any of those things are identical, but there's a sense in which the story that he's telling is about the interpenetration of those two things, and how in economy there isn't, for the category of labor to exist, for action to exist, there's a necessary interpenetration of those two realms in every moment and every time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that there is in action there is a real coincidence of opposites that occurs through our actions, where we bring these things together, and that those divides cease to exist.
Yeah, so I'm not super well read in symbolism or philosophy. I'm like semi-amateur in both, I guess. But I'm a big Pajot head, whatever his fans are called, right? Yeah. And so the way that he talks about spirit versus matter, or the way he talks about masculine and feminine, is very much in this line. But also another one that I put down that I think that he never explicitly recognizes this dichotomy, but he uses these words in ways that would fit, is answer and question, right? And that the world, in some sense, proposes a set of questions, and then with its material, like, or potential, or another one would be actual potential, right?
Yes.
And then through labor, you're answering a question. Now, you can give the wrong answer to a question.
You sure can,
right?
Yes.
That has to be recognized, and that's what, in a sense, sin probably is missing the mark.
That's right.
Given
That's
the
right.
question, right.
That's right.
But for missing the mark to happen, there has to be a question which is misanswered, and that's what matter, or the objective, or the real presents, is the question. But then the answer is in the potential solution to that question. And if the question doesn't go away, you did not dissolve the question, or you did not provide a solution to the question.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah. And this is, it's interesting. He presents all these pairs, and like one of the pairs that he presents, the ideal and the real, is one of the, Tomberg in Meditations on the Tarot, in letter 9 on the Hermit, he talks about 3 fundamental antinomies that need a personal synthesis. And by the way, the reason he says personal synthesis is because he's thinking along the same lines as Bulgakov. What he means by personal synthesis is you need to act as a person in the world in order to synthesize these antinomies for you in your life through your actions, because that's the only way to arrive at a personal synthesis. And the ideal and the real is one of those things. It's like he's like neither idealism nor realism. That you need a personal synthesis of idealism and realism that is embodied through your actions.
Yeah. So there's in one direction there's, well, the event that we're studying is an incarnation of something.
I love that you said event too.
Okay. Well, the what happens in the labor act is an attempt at, maybe you could say, incarnation, or later maybe what he'd say production, and the matter embodies, and the spirit informs, right? And that's the action going in both directions that's necessary for the event, which you like that word, I guess, event of the incarnation occurs.
Well, because I mean, it's like, I think it's Barth who said that God is an event, right? So I mean, that's like, and like we are also an event. Like we're made in the image of God. It's like our existence is a happening. It's a doing. Yeah. It's inseparable from, which is why when our philosophy and theology becomes overly disembodied, it goes very badly astray, because it's a failure to understand what we are. You know, we're something that's happening. Yeah.
Cool.
That's how, I mean, this is actually connected to, like, well, what does Jesus mean when he says, I am the truth? When you're referring to, when a person is referring to their own existence as the truth, they can't be talking about something that is an objective fact in the world, right? Nor is it right for us to think that Jesus is only talking about some subjective interiority that is accessible only to his own internal life. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to share it with us, right? So it's actually,
I mean, he's the truth, the way, and the life.
Right, exactly.
Which is the same ways that Bulgakov is using these terms.
Precisely right. Yeah.
So Christ is saying that him being the truth is the answer to the question. Like that's another way of saying a good solution or good answer is a true answer, right? And then the true answer is the one that maintains life. Yeah. Right. In the way that Bulgakov.
It's the embodied way that leads to life.
Yeah.
And to the triumph of life in that economy where death, it's like, and it's not like death doesn't, at least until the eschaton, death doesn't go anywhere. But it loses its ultimacy. Yes,
that is cool.
So it is no longer the great enemy, because it's been put in service of life.
Yes, yeah, and then that's what and I guess the larger question is, in the long run, you have these several attempts at, and we'll get into consumption production later, these attempts at maintaining life but there's something about you and your ability to solve these questions. Your spirit is insufficient to answer all of these questions that death proposes to you. There's you alone are very unlikely to solve it. You and your family and your community and the extended economy is maybe probably better, if you pull it off, or if there's a problem in the social body, then people die faster. Right. But ultimately, humanity, even as a whole, is unable to answer that death question.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Without the paratrooper and Jesus saving everybody.
Well, Adam is a stand-in for humanity as a whole.
Yes. Yeah. So
Christ becomes the new stand-in for humanity as a whole. So hey, it's okay. We're fine.
Yeah. And I said to you before we talked too that I watched yesterday Sam Tiedemann's first video on Spirit. I didn't watch the second one or the conversation with Rebecca and Pedro.
I've seen the first one because you recommended it to me, and I've seen the conversation. Okay. I think I might have saw the second one and not the first one, but it was really good.
The second one I just read the title. It's going to be more directly about what are angels, demons, that kind of
thing. Right, exactly.
Right. Which this question of subtle bodies too, in context of what Bulgakov calls bodies too, is that's interesting. We probably can't talk about that in this video though.
No, we'll have to get to that later. But I want to hear what you thought was illustrative in Sam's video.
So the way that he talks about spirit in his, and I'm familiar basically with the way that he was doing the statistical analysis, because we do that kind of thing in economics too, right? We do it in a more applied way, not in a theoretical way. Now that I think about it, I should send that video to my dad, because my dad is a statistician, so he might.
Oh, okay.
But so there's an underlying true line, right? That is what we call informing a data generating process, right? But if we just have the data generated by that process and we don't have the line, then we can keep throwing a bunch of lines at a set of data, trying to estimate it, right? And eventually, hopefully, landing on one that makes the least errors. And the one that makes the least errors, if we do some sort of evolutionary, or what he was calling a generative or genetic process, is the line that survives, that most embodies the spirit that answers that data. So we can think of the data points in his analogy as the objective mechanical laws of necessity, the forces of death. The standards, the variegated, seemingly random, from some perspectives, seemingly random questions that are proposed to these lines, and the lines are attempting to answer, and that live or die. But what's important about the way that he was trying to use to answer these questions was that every answer was randomly generated, right? It was a random attempt at mutation. So it's, to refer to another one of the pragmatists, Charles Sanders Peirce, who was kind of like William James' mentor, he called that a tychastic process, like Tyche after the goddess of fortune, right? Where there's these forces which might select against certain things, the forces of death we might call them, and then the attempted answers at these things are generated randomly, and then there's a trial and error process until they die. But it's possible, the way that one thing that I would respond to Sam's video is that what Peirce says in one of his essays called Evolutionary Love, which I highly recommend everyone reads, is that sometimes you don't get to that final answer without the mutation process itself being non-random in some way. In a sense, like I could probably have done better than the computer, at least in my first approximation, by just drawing a line on the screen, right? Instead of letting a random process occur, right? So, and this is what's super cool, and you're gonna like this, is Peirce calls that process, instead of tychastic, where it's ruled by randomness, agapastic, where it's ruled by love.
You know what's funny, Marcus? Do you know what the comment I left at I watched that, and I left the comment at the end of the video. Do you know what the comment I made was?
Go ahead.
What is the telos of love?
Yeah.
That would be the question I would want to ask for Vicky. Because you want to say it has no telos, and I get the reasons you want to resist saying it has no telos. They're actually good. Like I could make those arguments on Christian grounds. It's like the idea of like of creation being the pure gift of God and not needing to have a purpose in order to justify its existence is a perfectly defensible Christian thing to say. So then the question I would want to ask John is, what is the telos of love?
Yeah. Or what? And in some sense, it's trying to answer things into existence almost. That's the way at least that I think of it in it's trying to answer things where they're at.
Right.
Because it's trying to see what are all of the actual material problems that this thing faces, and how can I provide it a form which allows it to respond to those and maintain its life.
Right.
That's the way that I'd say it. So you can still tell a Darwinian evolutionary story. I understand the logic of it, and so does Peirce. But he's saying that there's a sense in which love shortcuts that process, because it's possible the tykastic process never resolves the situation. It's possible that it goes on in a circle of samsara or whatever forever, right?
Right.
Agapasm directly answers the question.
Well, it also allows for the created to discover its own purposes,
mm-hmm.
and for that to be enabled by love.
Mm-hmm. Because so the pragmatists are very much responding to the Darwinian sort of watershed in science, right? So a lot of Peirce's other stuff, and partly what he's talking about in that essay, Evolutionary Love, is trying to describe an evolutionary metaphysics,
right?
In which when things come to be, they come to be because there's an interplay between necessity and freedom. Right? Mm-hmm. Freedom being, in a sense, the mutations, very, very roughly for people familiar with the Darwinian terms, freedom being the random mutations, and then necessity being the laws of selection, the natural selection. But one thing that in one of William James' most interesting essays, they're responding to people like Herbert Spencer, who had these other ideas about how evolution works almost as a mechanical necessary process, the entire thing of evolution being mechanically necessary. James is saying, no, it's always a back and forth in evolution. Right. There's a response, and then the world says, this animal's not shaped right, it's going to die, killed. Or this animal's shaped right, it's going to survive. And then when certain animals survive and other ones die, they actually inform those selection processes themselves. So then you have a different set of animals. Now you have different predators, different prey. And so now there's different selection processes. So it's a story that necessarily requires studying the actual history of the events.
That's right. Yeah, well, it's also like it opens up a way to think about evolution that is more properly, and I would think naturally, since you're talking about a biological phenomenon, that returns it more to the principles of organism, mm-hmm. and less to the principles of mechanism. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is what Sam is trying to do. I think in that video, he's trying to do that too. But Vervaeke's pushback on telos is a good pushback.
Yeah,
and I think trying to theorize like some sort of like involvement of some kind of notion of love operating within an evolutionary framework is probably the way to resolve it. But I've just now encountered it today, and I'm just beginning to think about it.
Yeah,
and nowhere close to being able to propose anything, but I think that's the direction to look.
The other response that I had to Sam's video in that line was that, and he would know this too as a statistician, is that sometimes you have data that's confusing enough that multiple lines fit it equally well. Right. Depending on the kind of estimator function that you're using. Right. And so it's possible that there's a eternal ambiguity of spirit such that you become, in a sense, some sort of nihilistic about what something's purpose actually is. So that's I think probably where Vervaeke's criticisms come in, is that there needs to still, but also Pajot's ultimate responses is that there still needs to be something more than just fittedness to the facts as they are, right? There's something must come from outside the system to inform how it's going to move forward. And that's what we call love or spirit or something like that.
I think actually, where I would want to go is, I mean, where I went in that conversation I just did about Peterson's God. Mm-hmm. And that is that for us, at least as human beings, the experience of personhood is And I don't mean prior in a temporal sense, but I mean in a logical sense. Our experience of personhood is more fundamental to us than our being, because the only way that we can understand our being at all is mediated through our experience as persons. So for us, personhood is actually beyond being, and so that I think Vervaeke would be open to this, because he's always talking about because he's very much open to a kind of relational metaphysics. And so if you are using person as a starting point for doing your metaphysics, instead of looking at the metaphysics of substance, then I think that begins to open up new horizons of possibility that aren't very much explored. And I would think, by the way, I think that's what the David Walsh book that you turned me on to, that seems to be what David is very much doing in that book. The Politics of Person is the Politics of Being.
Yeah.
And I think he's
Which I haven't read. I just recommended it to you. I haven't.
Yeah, no, you should read it. It's really like he's trying to push personalism in some new directions that are really interesting. I haven't had a chance to finish the book yet, but I've just started it barely, and it's already kind of like blowing my mind how insightful it is. And I think it's very bold, and I don't know how successful it is, but it's definitely it's actually pointing in some provocative directions.
Yeah, and it's very. I met him once, but he gave a talk. I forget exactly what it was on, but the conversation went towards Abraham Lincoln for some reason.
Okay.
But so one thing to kind of conclude this section on to conclude chapter 1 kind of is to say I wanted to start.
We've touched on concepts from chapter 2 and 3 too, to be fair.
Yeah, we've been getting into that. We've been getting it. Yeah. Chapter 2, I think we can actually kind of skip over almost, because we talked about it. Yeah, in all our allusions to philosophy, we've kind of covered what he talks about.
I agree.
But so what I wanted to do was take some of.
Although the one thing worth talking about maybe is the way he talks about consumption, and then ends up connecting it to the Eucharist, is maybe worth mentioning.
Yeah, but that's almost all in chapter 3, though, I think.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. Well, consumption's in chapter 3, but.
Oh, is that? I thought it was in chapter 2. Okay.
But but what I wanted to do was take some of this. Economics is about the struggle of necessity. That we're one of the, I don't know if we've expressed it this way in the video, but it's very clear in the. No, it was in those 2 paragraphs we read, where life is struggling against necessity without denying the necessity, right? So it's overcoming these principles of death without denying any one of them, right? So I wrote down here, let's say, economists might think of these as constraints or necessary conditions, sometimes in the more formal way that we talk about it. So some sort of assumed, usually oftentimes when we're talking about just someone purchasing something, budget constraints, right? Like I can't spend more money than is in my wallet, right? But also I'll say 3 constraints here. So both Nate and I need 5 units of water and 5 units of food every day to live, right? This is a minimum condition for us in some way, right? If we have under that, we die. And then two other constraints that are unique to either one of us, right? Me and my particular condition, I can produce 10 food a day, or I can produce 1 water, right? And let's say that my time is perfectly divisible between those 2 things. So if I spend my day making 5 food, I can spend the other half making half a water or something like that, right? So any combination. So basically, the way that he used the word technology later, I can pick any combination of food and water, trading off my time between producing food and water. I could produce up to 10 food, but no matter how much food I give up to try to produce water, I'm not going to have enough to survive myself, right? And then we'll say a third constraint on Nate. You can produce 10 water a day, but only 1 food. So you're confronted with basically the same problem in that you can't meet your necessary conditions for life given the technologies that you face, right? But you have an abundance of water, I have an abundance of food, right? And so anyone who's taken like a basic intro economics class would notice this as an example of comparative advantage, right? And that my time making water is more costly for me because I'm so much more productive at making food, and I'm giving up more food every time I make water. You are the symmetric case where you're much better at making water, so every time you spend making food, you don't have enough water. And both of us in isolation would be overwhelmed by death, and would then our life would be destroyed because of this necessary condition to sustain our bodies with food and water, right? But if both of us can solve the problem in a sense, I produce 10 units of food, you produce 10 units of water, and then I give you 5 units of food in exchange for 5 units of water, both of us have met that condition which allows us to survive while not denying any of those 3 necessary principles.
Right. I love this, especially on the heels of just talking about evolution and the idea of struggle, because Thomberg has these 2 parallel notions he talks about. He talks about horizontal evolution, which presents itself as the struggle for existence, and its telos is just evolution toward the will to power, right? That's how horizontal evolution operates. But it's not. But horizontal evolution isn't the full story, because also acting is a vertical evolution. And the vertical evolution is defined as cooperation for existence. So, acts as a counterbalance to that horizontal evolution, and it is oriented toward love. And so we have this. You're pointing at economy as being the very possibility of the existence of economy as a social arrangement amongst human beings is by its nature, at some level, a participation in vertical evolution that is working contrary to the forces of horizontal evolution.
Yeah. So in a sense, the pattern of trade between us is the spirit answering the material facts of both of our productive capacity and then our need to consume 5 units of water, 5 units of food each. So those are the facts. Those are the questions. Those are the circumstances, the constraints, and the answer, or the spirit, is the act of trade. Now, I can tell you a different story with different constraints, like where let's say I know how to produce 4 units of food, 4 units of water, and I can do both of those at once. You only know how to do 1 unit of either, right? Then that's called I kill you, take your stuff, and I survive, you don't, right? That's another story, right?
Right. But that is one, like, we do have these things that are, these forces are both real.
Yes.
And operate in a fallen world. You have both this horizontal evolution that is, Thomberg says its telos is the will to power. He also says its author is the serpent, right? That the horizontal evolution proceeds according to the principles of the serpent. But the vertical evolution is essentially God's counteracting, following the world back into creation. But you could see both of those solutions, both the trade solution and the I kill you solution, as spirits answering these situations. Right. Yes. Right? Precisely right. They're both spirits, right? Yeah. One may be more angelic, one more demonic. Right. No, that's right. Yeah. So so that helped me make a little bit more concrete, and maybe more concrete to other economists who might watch this, how this exactly plays out in terms of the way that we normally talk. And so another category that economists are obsessed with, and a lot of fundamental debates in economics are about choice and rational choice, whether our choices are rational or not, or whether we should assume people choose according to rational principles. But more fundamentally, what a choice is a confrontation with these several constraints and the way in which someone attempts to answer these situations. And so what did I write down here? Choice is only a problem if you have limited knowledge. So if I'm unaware of this possibility of trade, then I have to make some other choice. Then I'm actually confronted with the agony of choice, right? So the question of whether choices are rational or not is a question of, or how choices are made whatsoever,
maybe you would call them acts of labor in Bulgakov's terminology, is to what extent are we allowed to presume knowledge about different forms, right? So you need to have an actor who's has some knowledge about some ways to solve certain situations, but maybe you need someone who has an awareness and imagination to come up with something new, an entrepreneurial action, a reorganization of productions, a reorganization confronting the same facts, confronting the same necessities, but with more sustenance of life, maybe for themselves or for others, right? So that's cool. And then just the last thing I wrote about this chapter is that labor, or maybe you might say choice, is the name for all of the engagements in this struggle. And then there's a meta question: are people better able to make rational choices or not? Choices which actually answer the question of sustaining their own life against these forces or not, right? And that's where psychology and econ struggle with each other and stuff like that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. So
hopefully that makes it a little bit more concrete, and it shows it's the mixture. Then that's political economy and philosophy of economy touching each other.
Right.
In an example like that. Because so far that's my complaint is he, give me like a story, give me like one example, please. Hopefully, because economists love examples because we're so practical.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Like Adam Smith is so well known for his really, really good illuminating examples, and Friedrich Hayek is not.
Yeah.
Because Hayek was a German thinker, so he proceeds in like these categories, blah blah blah, things. Like that.
Sure.
Okay, so what else would you want to? I maybe have 15 minutes left or something like that. So
no, I think we're off to a good start. I think we really touched on everything that's critical from the first three chapters. Looking forward to the next one.
Yeah. Well, let's say quickly what he means by consumption and production, because this is really weird. This stuff, it's in some sense intuitive, but it is really weird to the way that economists talk about this typically, which but both consumption and production are concerned with this basic economic problem that my life confronts death, right? Yeah. Consumption is more about maybe what you'd call a metabolic problem, and he associates this with consumption is asserting the fact that my life is part of a monistic universe, and it has to be balanced with all of these other things. And then production.
He's insistent on that, by the way. That's actually that caught my attention. He is Bulgakov is not having multiverse theory. He's like, and I think he's right too.
That's right. He says
because if you're talking about multiverses, then you haven't understood the meaning of the term universe.
Yeah.
And you're actually just positing a more complex universe that contains other universes within it. But the term universe would only apply to the thing that is the container for all the multiverses. That would be the universe. So Bulgakov's right to insist on that.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but it's too. So if consumption is about asserting these monistic constraints, the fact that how would you say it? I need sustenance in a sense to keep my body. That my body is operating, and it has this energy, and it's exhausting that energy out, and I need to somehow pull energy back in.
Yeah.
Right. And so I need a sufficient maintenance of energy to keep this life thing going, because if my body was a closed system, I would not need to consume to keep it alive. Yeah. But it's an open system.
Also points to the fact that it's an interaction between life and death, because it's like it's what you need to sustain your life, but you eat dead things.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So
though the way he talks about the Eucharist makes that more complicated.
Yes.
And I don't actually understand. I understand the point of why the Eucharist is relevant, but I don't understand how it works.
He wants to talk to the Eucharist because he wants to point toward the way in which the Eucharist is pointing toward the way in which the victory of the principle of life is inevitable.
Yeah.
Because the Eucharist is the meal where we're, instead of eating the body of death that we're forced to eat in normal consumption, we're now eating the body of immortal life.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why that's why he wants to show how the Eucharist is a special case of consumption that that overcomes death and scarcity.
Yeah. And that is so interesting. And so just to be brief about it, production is in a sense asserting my particular life and my particular body over the world, right? Saying actually that part of the universe, which is monistically, organically always related to me, is now a part of me. It's informed by my spirit, not Nate's spirit. This is my cup, not Nate's cup.
Right.
It's part of my body, not Nate's body, something like that, right?
Right.
So that and then I'm extending myself in ways that, like, having this cup helps me drink, which helps me consume. So having a larger body helps me maintain my life without the cup.
That's an interesting part too when he talks about the larger body, because that really resonated with me, because what he says when he talks about the expansion of, like, the way in which our body expands basically into, like, he takes the idea of us, of man as a microcosm, like, quite literally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me of actually Douglas Harding's Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth, where he talks about the layers, and Harding points that away that in a very real way, when an astronomer is looking at a star through a telescope, his body is extending to that star. And Bulgakov is echoing the very same idea here in this chapter when he talks about production. The way that
he talks about when the subject acts mentally, it is still an act of labor in that it's engaging with these, maybe you might think of them as forces of logic or concepts or facts that I'm trying to put together in a mental construct, which then become a subsidiary input into my production into the world, right?
Yeah,
but both of them are still, it's not that kind of production is not actually totally isolated to the eye. It's still the eye confronting other concepts, which I then have to engage with.
Right.
Yeah. And so that actually answers that what I said right way at the beginning about this paragraph where he has Smith and Marx in the same paragraph.
Okay.
I won't. Let me see, actually, because I'll have it highlighted definitely because I paid extra attention to it because of my bias. Well, what he talks about. Let me see. Oh, no, it's in the section on production for sure.
Okay, hold on. Let's see if I can find it first.
Oh, here, I got it. It's on page 118 of my PDF version. Yeah.
Okay.
He says, "It is yet in vain would we look here for philosophical extension of." Okay. Oh, well, actually, I'll say first this larger thing that he says about the labor theory of value, which if we talked about a little bit more in the conversation we did about a year ago, which is. The labor theory of value is a really controversial thing in the history of economics, and it's still the only people that really hold to a strict version of it are contemporary Orthodox Marxists.
Gotcha.
But it's this, it's a complicated thing. I won't get into all the details, but if you go back to the other video, I talk about the water diamond paradox and how that's an essential problem here. But basically. What he says is the way that he taught the labor theory of value, even if we think it's wrong in a number of particular ways, the way that he's talking about labor is pointing out pointing out why it's so intuitive to people. Right. And that if labor is a fundamental part of this life's struggle against death, and all production and all consumption is somehow involved in labor acts, then there's no way to say that labor is not fundamentally involved in all economic value, whatever you want to call value. And so he goes, so it seems like a simple modus ponens or whatever it's called, that, oh, well, labor is super important, right? So labor should be, this importance of labor should be reflected in the phenomena of economic activity, right? Therefore, labor is this integral ingredient in the price, right? So the labor theory of value ends up with certain kinds of theories that Marx works with that are something like, well, the price of something is always determined in the market by the amount of labor that's put into it, or the labor that's put into the objective crystallized form of it, right? And so so in the capitalist mode of production, there's this weird hiccup where, okay, so how do you price labor? How do you price wages? And there's a systematic way in which labor is underpriced. So the wage is always lesser than the full value. The price of labor is always less than the full value of labor. So the laborer is never getting full receipt for what the value that he puts into the economy, and that's all gobbled up by the capitalist, right? But and then so in this,
I would say, however, in Bulgakov's definition of labor, I think capital also falls under his definition of labor is still encompassing that capital is labor for Bulgakov.
So what?
And not only that, it's labor, and it's also to get back to the whole like evolutionary, vertical evolution, horizontal evolution. Not only is it labor, but it is also vertical evolution, because the purpose of capital is toward the of investment in capital is toward the cooperation of existence. That's what it's for.
Yes. It's well, capital also in his terminology would be expanding your technology. Right. Your labor can now answer more questions, or can vault over more constraints in a way.
So he's actually taking what is for Marx and he doesn't actually. And so far, he hasn't even used it. We'll see if he talks about capital later. But so far, I think he's deliberately omitted it because I think he's just synthesizing.
Yeah, capital is extended body after production, right? Yeah. But labor is always integrally involved in everything. But he says, that is labor, is understood in an extremely narrow sense, merely as applied to explaining the mechanism of prices and to the theory of commodity exchange value, which he thinks is improper, right? And so when labor theory of value gets made fun of by Austrian economists or marginalists or all these other groups, that's what they're making fun of, is labor as a solution to what are the commodities going to be priced on the market, because it's an insufficient explanation. But then he says, as a result, the concept of labor contracts in political economy to a Smithian definition of productive labor, that is labor expressed only in material products. For example, Marx defines values as accretions or crystals of labor, and labor as the expenditure of human energy. Energy is in turn defined with crude and naive materialism as the expenditure of nerves, muscles, bones, physiological energy. Now, what's super important about that, and I'm not putting this, or I'm not reading this into Bulgakov, but I'd like to pull it out, is he says the Smithian definition of productive labor. Now, Smith has two kinds of labor in The Wealth of Nations, productive and unproductive. And by unproductive, he doesn't mean useless or a waste of time. He just distinguishes between productive and unproductive because he wants to talk about when the labor creates something outside of itself, which can then be used to sustain the whole, right? Gotcha. Like a farmer produces wheat and then can then eat that wheat and sustain himself with it, versus what he says, a servant or a soldier are doing unproductive labor, because like a soldier in a standing army is just sitting there waiting for a battle to happen, right? He doesn't produce, and then we need the farmers to produce enough food for themselves to eat and for the soldiers to eat, right? But that's not to say that the soldier isn't doing something in this larger abstract sense. Right. Yeah, right? So what he's saying is that I'm reading this into Bulgakov, but I'm reading this into Bulgakov so that Bulgakov is defending Smith against Marx, which is that Marx misidentified labor in Smith as only the productive labor. So he missed how the entire rest of the apparatus, or people who are not directly exerting muscles and energy into the world, are also part of the productive process.
I don't think you're reading into it that much because I don't think you're reading into it too much, because he is very clear. Like Bulgakov is unambiguously clear that like non-muscular mental labor is very much labor in accordance with his definition of labor. He actually talks about that even art for him is like a special category of labor, but it's still, so like art has this additional category that makes it something that is interesting. We never talked about that. Yeah. He does have this special category for art where art is somehow doing something more than labor. Yeah. But it still also falls within the definition of labor, but has an additional factor beyond what labor does.
So I wrote this down in my notes too. Man does not live on bread alone. Right. And so there are some additional necessary constraints somehow on our life that is potentially killing us if we only consume bread. Right. If we consume bread and not also what you'd maybe call art or pleasure or love or good tasting food or instructions from your priest or experiences with God or the Eucharist, you also die.
And yes, precisely right. And Bulgakov understands that, and his vision is all encompassing, and it does embrace all that. And in the case of art, he actually recognizes where it is like somehow even like more important than other forms of labor.
Yeah. So and I was thinking back to reading. So he does say here, political economy. This is 114, 115. Political economy, in contrast, though it has never from its inception neglected the principle of labor, has, as a result of its lack of philosophical sophistication and the limitations of its spiritual horizons, failed to use this principle properly, to find an appropriate place for it. And it received a place entirely inappropriate to its philosophical significance. First of all, in political economy, in the theory, in the works of Adam Smith, in practice, in those of most of its exponents, narrowed the concept of labor to that of productive labor expressed in material goods. So he does recognize there Smith's distinction between productive and unproductive labor, in which Smith means the production of external material goods, right? And then he says, in practice, in those of most of its exponents, meaning he's not putting the blame on Smith. He's not putting the blame on Smith. He's putting the blame on
He's talking about people who have over focused on one aspect of
that is Smith's Ricardo and Marx.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So he's exonerating Smith left and right.
100%.
This is great. Yeah.
Yeah.
This
for
is
sure.
great. Okay, that's kind of all I have.
Oh, well, we ran exactly as long as we thought we would.
Good.
And there's time for you to get to church. So thank you for joining me.
We gotta make sure we do it in the next couple of months, maybe the next one.
Okay.
If we've got the time, because we don't want to wait.
We'll work out. We'll figure out a date after the fact, and I won't keep you any longer, so you have time to get to church.
Sure.
Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Nate.